G'day guys, welcome back to the Rugby League Guru podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Neds, our official partners for season 2024. And we had something else lined up for today, but then of course some of the new Hall of Famers for Rugby League dropped yesterday, and I thought, you know what a special occasion. Let's go through and give my live reaction to all of those. Kat, welcome in. Now, from someone who, you're not new to Rugby League, but you're not as engulfed in it.
I'm not the guru.
You're not the guru.
Yeah.
I haven't pre-warned Kat. I'm going to ask this because I want to get her live reaction. What does the Hall of Fame mean to you, Kat? And I want you to be completely honest.
Okay. Hall of Fame is to me, that was a weirdly structured sentence.
Yeah.
Hall of Fame to me is it's got to be a mix of a few things. It's players that have broken. Wow, I'm on a roll.
Yeah.
Broken certain records or set a standard for the sport. But then on top of that, I think having some kind of cultural influence as well. So, off the bat, looking at Greg Inglis and his impact, me seeing him as part of the Hall of Fame is not just because of what he did on the field, but also the impact that he's had on the game, the conversation around the game. I think someone that is both subjectively and objectively had an impact.
Okay, you answered that a lot better than what I thought you would.
What did you think I would say?
I just the thing that annoys me a little bit about the Hall of Fame thing is that these players get announced at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday via an Instagram post. I think, and obviously for
honestly, I think Roasty hypes up the hottest 100 more than that.
I agree with you, and that is crazy. I personally think that when we're going through the greatest players of all time and putting them into the Hall of Fame, obviously the Immortals we make a really big deal about, but even the Immortals, Kat, it's like no one knows how it works. No one knows when it's happening. It is just all over the place. And the Hall of Fame, I think, is a much more it's easier to define and to understand, but I think we need to make more out of it. For me,
definitely.
this should have been like a Dally M. This should have been on the Dally M night, in my opinion. This should be a bigger deal than what it is. For me to find out that these players are now Hall of Fame players of our game, which means the absolute world to me via an Instagram post on a Wednesday afternoon when I didn't know it was happening, that is just wild. And whether it's true or not, the reports that I've got is that these guys got phone calls to let them know from interns at the NRL. Like, I think that we need to take the history of our game and the best players of our game. I think it needs to be taken more seriously. And it's probably not fair, but at the same time, I compare it to the Hall of Fame in the NFL, which is a massive, massive thing. It is a hallmark event, as it should be. And I just think we don't take it as seriously as what we should. It was only a few weeks ago. We got Wayne Bennett. He's a current coach being in the Hall of Fame, and he deserves to be there 100%. But it was literally an Instagram post to move on to the next. I wish we had a build up to it. I wish we knew it was coming. It just seems a little bit all over the place to me. And we're going to talk about them today. Yesterday, I had some of my favorite players and some of the greatest players of all time and the players that dominated my childhood that were put into this. And the worth that was around it, I just don't feel like it's as high as what it should be, Kat.
No, it's hard to disagree with you because there was absolutely no hype about it before it came out.
Nothing.
When I make the joke about hottest 100, I mean it. We're in the social media realm these days where you do have to hype things up. They get lost in the mix of content, and this is something that is actually really incredible. And I think even more than that, these days, a lot of the likes of Sam Burgess, GI, when we were at Souths the other day, they said when they want to do something on their social media that they know is just going to hit, they just play Sam Burgess or GI clips because they know they're going to do well. We're living in an era where current players are referencing and looking at actual content and footage of previous players, and we need to hype it up more. It means a lot more for the game.
We need to hype it up at all.
Yeah.
Like more, but at all. Like I just can't believe there was no... Like we didn't know this was coming. I'm sorry to start on a negative note, but I want it to have a positive outcome that this is built up and as special as it should be. These are the greatest players to ever play our game who have sacrificed their bodies for 16, 17, 18 years, some of these guys, and are going to be sacrificing their bodies for the rest of their lives as well.
Because of that.
I think the least we can do is put on an evening where it is a big deal about them. And maybe that's to come by the NRL, and if so, fantastic. But I think that it should be announced on the night. I think it should be built up. The reason why we love the Dally M medal is because you don't know who's going to get it. You want to know. I think it should be the same with these Hall of Fame guys, and I just think it can be done in a better fashion. Personally, it blows me away. This is how it's done. But
yeah, hard to disagree with.
We'll park that. Let's stick to the positives of these great players. Kat's going to go through, read out the names. I'm going to give my live reaction to each of them as we go. Won't spend forever on them. And some of these guys I never saw play. I know about them. Some of these guys I watched their career from literally start to finish. So there's a lot to talk about there. And then at the end, I'm going to give my takes on which of these guys I think should be in consideration for immortality, which is another huge conversation point.
Yes.
Kathmandu, you take us away.
All right. Well, let's just make our way through the list.
Yeah.
We won't drop any spoilers for anyone who's not sure who's actually been inducted.
Yes.
I think that will make it more fun. So let's kick it off.
Just in case you didn't have Instagram at 4 p.m. yesterday afternoon.
Just in case.
Yeah.
Just in case. Lionel Morgan was the first name on the inductees list. Now, he was a trailblazer as the first ever Indigenous athlete to represent Australia in any major code.
Yeah, pretty special. And look, I didn't watch his career. I haven't really seen much tape of him, obviously, or anything like that. So I can't speak too much. But obviously the first Indigenous player to be picked in an Australian representative team, which is pretty special. We know a couple of years later, obviously Artie Beetson, he'd be the first one to captain an Australian team. Artie Beetson, obviously an immortal and obviously in the Hall of Fame as well. But yeah, pretty special stuff there to be the first Indigenous person to be picked in an Australian side. That is pretty special. And
very special.
You know what, like to probably younger people that might not, like the relevance of that might not matter, but at the time, an enormous step. Absolutely enormous.
Yeah, I think there's a real emphasis these days on those trailblazers as we learn more about the stories and the people that played those pivotal roles. And once again, I think this will come up a lot, is the prevalence of social media and how easy it is to know Benji Marshall's whole life story now.
Yeah.
We didn't know those things about players previously.
Yeah.
We didn't have that access to them. So I think we're learning a lot more about them, and it's nice to see those elements being taken note later as well.
And I think he also played an active role in like junior development, everything in Queensland after his retirement. Unfortunately, he did pass away in 2023, but an unbelievable achievement for him and for his family.
Absolutely. All right, let's move on to the next inductee. This is Les Boyd. We were talking about him this morning as well. He's one that you know a little bit about. You obviously weren't around for his career, but you saw a chunk of it definitely in your research. But he was known as one of the hard men of the game, playing during one of the toughest eras. I definitely would not have wanted to be a rugby league player back then in the 70s and 80s, and he represented Australia in 17 test matches.
Yeah, this one is probably the most controversial one, if I'm being completely honest with you. I didn't watch Les Boyd's career from start to finish, so I'm not the person to make a judgment call on this. He's obviously a fantastic player. I didn't see much of him, but what I've always been told about Les Boyd is just the brutality and how tough he was when he played. He's a guy that I think altogether he had about 18 months worth of suspension from rugby league. So I have seen a lot of uproar on social media about Les Boyd being included in this, and I can't comment because I didn't watch the entire career. I don't have all the context, but I know, for example, like I think it was 1983 in Origin, obviously broke the big man's jaw, Darryl Broman there, which is obviously a very controversial one, sort of cost him a kangaroo selection, et cetera, et cetera. He had a few other incidents throughout his career, but a very interesting one that when I saw it live, yes, I didn't think too much of it. Then I thought about it after and seeing it on social media and seeing people's opinions and getting the opinions of people that are much older than me and lived throughout his career, that even they were a little bit surprised, especially in a day and age, Kat, where we are literally changing the fabric of our game constantly to lean away from this sort of stuff. I just thought that was interesting. But I wasn't alive to watch his entire career and whatnot. Obviously, a great player, representing the Kangaroos on numerous occasions. But I do understand why people find that one a little bit controversial.
Yeah, definitely. It is a bit controversial.
It is. There's no denying it. And I just find it interesting. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall for that conversation, because what Les Boyd represents what rugby league used to be, and that was a fantastic time. but Les Boyd does not represent what rugby league is now in the direction that the NRL is trying to take rugby league to. Yeah. So I just find that an interesting talking point. I'm not saying he shouldn't be in there or anything like that by any means, because he does represent what rugby league was then. It was built on these guys.
I think that's the point.
Yeah.
He plays a key role in acknowledging a part of rugby league history, which was when it was like that. And he embodied that.
And if that is the purpose of putting him in there, I actually respect that by the NRL, that they acknowledge this is where we've come from. This is what the game was built on. These sort of guys, that they were important. You know, no matter what it is, like you've never seen you never see a good movie without a villain in it. You need your villains and whatnot. Les Boyd was that kind of guy. Also, the absolute hero you want on your team when he is on your team. Sure. But yeah, I respect the NRL for making that decision. I am just a little bit surprised, if I'm completely honest, that they did, but credit to them. So I won't say any more on that. Congratulations to Les Boyd and the Boyd family. Incredible stuff, but it is just an interesting talking point.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's move on to the Lebanese addition to the list. This inductee, it's fair to say he had an incredible impact on the game, and his bloodline is still having an impact on the game. Benny Elias played 235 matches for Balmain Tigers, as well as 6 test matches and 19 State of Origins.
Yeah, backdoor Benny, they called him. One of the greatest nines we've ever seen. I always say Benny Elias, he's the turning point as far as hookers go. Before Benny Elias, your hookers that were dominating, of the time and were the guys at that point, they weren't in attack, they weren't as creative as Benny. For me, he was the first halfback hooker. So the first guy that you could build, plays and a game plan around a hooker, because he was just so creative. He brought creativity into the 9 role previously, and I think you need to remember, before Benny Elias, back then there was, scrums were all contested, and that's the sole reason why it was called hooker, because they'd be in the middle, they'd have to use their feet to hook for the ball and try and get it. That was their role. Whereas now in the modern game, we couldn't care less about scrums. Calling it hooker is almost outrageous nowadays. Yeah. There hasn't been a hooker that has tried to hook for a ball in 30 years. And when you do see it in the NRL, the refs go, whoa, that didn't look right. Come back and do it again. Stick to the plan. Let the ball go to the team that was meant to get it. The game has changed so much. But Benny Elias, he was the first hooker that brought creativity into that role. And if you go back and watch that Balmain side, sort of, 80s into the early 90s, just the way that they would structure plays around Benny Elias, it was just revolutionary. And obviously we've got those famous scenes of him up at Lang Park celebrating with his mum after the Origin victory. For me, the moment I'll never forget with Benny Elias, I think it's the 89 grand final, he takes a shot at field goal, Cat, and the ball hits the crossbar and it bounces back, and it is the loudest ding you've ever heard, and it will just forever echo through rugby league. Obviously, the Balmain Tigers didn't win a comp with that group. We're very unlucky not to, and that's one of the biggest moments, and it adds to what is one of the greatest grand finals of all time, the 89 grand final. We've got it on the poster up on the wall up there. Pretty special stuff. Benny Elias, a great player. Obviously, him and Steve Walters went head-to-head for a number of years. Walters being the Queensland hooker, Benny being the New South Wales hooker, and then they sort of ate Australian games off each other, because they were always in competition. It's one of the greatest rivalries we've ever seen, and they used to love a stink as well, which was great. But yeah, Benny Elias, a fantastic player, and as you said, the uncle of Mitch Moses, still doing tremendous things to this day.
Unreal stuff. Okay, let's move on to the next inductee. This is one of the leading try scorers in Brisbane Broncos history, Steve Renouf. He's a 4-time premiership winner. I mean, anyone who has paid attention to any rugby league has heard this name before. Tell us your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, tremendous player, the Pearl, just one of the most entertaining guys we have ever seen. When you have a look at his career, and for me, it's those tries in the early 90s in those grand finals. We've actually got the 1992 grand final poster on the wall as well, Broncos Dragons, and he scores that try where he bounces over the try line. Just tremendous stuff. A proud Indigenous man who had a brilliant career, one of the fastest players we've ever seen. He really did personify the brand of footy the Broncos played in the early 90s. It was sideline to sideline. And if you even just have a look at that try that he scores in that grand final, that ball is played on the tram line on the right-hand side, and it goes through 3 sets of hands, all long balls coming out to him. Just an excitement machine. And he's done he actually came up the other day in a podcast we were doing a lot of fantastic work.
Well, it's actually really interesting. If you do want to go see that conversation, I believe it's anyway.
What was it?
We were talking about players people would like to see part of the modern day game.
Oh, of course.
So a lot of people said they'd love to see the Pearl in one of today's sides.
Yeah. And obviously the Broncos, they have an incredibly rich history of fantastic players. Steve Renouf would be in my best Broncos side every day of the week, would absolutely shit in. So champion player, very good bloke, doing a lot of good things post rugby league, working for, I believe it's Deadly Choices. He's a big part of that charity and everything. So doing tremendous things up there, Steve Renouf, one of the greats.
So good. Okay, let's move on to Cam Smith. Another very well-known individual in the game's history, and easily one of the most decorated. I think that would be fair to say. Whether you are a Melbourne Storm supporter or not, you know who Cam Smith is. 430 NRL matches. It's a lot of games, and not to mention all the state of origins that fall under his name too. That was 42 of them.
Yeah. Look, it's a lot of games. It's an unbelievable amount of games when you're playing hooker and defending in the middle like this guy did. Cam Smith, I've said for a long time, I think that he has had the greatest career in rugby league. I just, especially of the modern era, without a doubt. You can go back to some of the Immortals, from the 60s that won 11 comps in a row and put up an argument there. In the NRL era, ever since it was essentially, it was a 5-tackle game instead of unlimited tackles, I think Cam Smith's got the best career. He's arguably the best player we've ever seen. I've got sort of him and Joey. I always say I think Joey was the best player. I think Cam Smith had the best career. But to play 438 games or whatever the hell it was, like that just shows the dedication that Cam Smith had to his body.
And also not to mention 56 test matches for Australia as well, and 30-something of those were as captain.
Yeah, just it honestly is insane. And like you even mentioned like the amount of state of origin games he played, like the amount of times Cam Smith had back up from origin, which now when guys back up from origin play clubland, I just go, what the fuck are you doing? Why
you
are you
don't need
up?
to.
You don't need to do this. Your body won't be able to handle this. Cameron Smith looked like an accountant on day one, looked like a slightly older accountant on day fucking 10,050 or whatever it was. Just unbelievable how his career played out, all that he achieved, the leader that he was. He obviously went through ups and downs and, the salary cap drama, all this sort of stuff, and you can bring that into contention if you want. But for close to a decade, in my opinion, he was the best player in the game, which is unbelievable when you think about all the other players in the game and even the players on this list. It is incredible. And, obviously he won a few Dally M medals as well, Cam Smith, which he thoroughly deserved. And I think it's worth noting, and we'll talk about it with Slater and Smith, that my biggest issue with the Dally M medal is that guys that are in teams with other stars, they get points taken off them. These guys were stealing points from each other week in, week out, and they still managed to come out with a few Dally M's each. It's incredible. So Cam Smith, impressive. He is an absolute shit-in to be an immortal for me. I will not hear any conversations against Cam Smith being an immortal, let alone a Hall of Famer.
Okay, let's move on to, we mentioned the Indigenous influence. One of the biggest Indigenous role models, without a doubt, is Jonathan Thurston, but the impact that he had in the rugby league space is incredible. 4 Dally M's. He was part of that Cowboys side's first premiership in 2015. Tell us your thoughts on him making it on the list.
Yeah, I love JT. Was told he was too small to play in the first place. I was at the 2004 grand final, which is the first time I ever saw Thurston live. And I'll never forget, with about 10 or 15 minutes to go, you Bulldogs fans would know better than me. But I remember he came on and he kicked a ball into the corner, and it was just a perfect little nudge. And I remember sitting there with my old man watching, going, fuck, that was an unbelievable kick in this moment, in this game, for the age he's at, all that sort of stuff. Remember, he was only in that grand final because Steve Price was ruled out of that game, went up to the North Queensland Cowboys and did what he did up there. An incredible player, JT. For me, though, you look at JT compared to these other guys, and when you look at like premierships and whatnot, he only won the one premiership. He won the 2 premierships, one at Canterbury. The teams that he won the comp for was in 15. Realistically, that's his moment. He didn't have his greatest game in that grand final. He came up with the moment. But for me, what separates JT from everyone else, I think there's a very good argument. He's the greatest state of origin player we've ever seen. Some of the The moments that JT came up with in Origin were just off its head. And was he in a good team? Yes, he was. Did he have stars? Yes, he did. But Origin, I don't care what you fucking say. Origin's not easy. I don't care who's next to you, who's around.
It's even harder to stand out when you're amongst talent.
Yeah. And he was always the go-to. The amount, like, I think people forget in that 8 in a row, I think they had 2 clean sweeps. They won 3-0. Every other series, we were in it. And it was always Thurston who just came up with that play, that pass, that kick, that desperation moment that just always broke us. So as much as he might not have the premierships, he's obviously got the Dally M's on other people, which you can have your arguments about Dally M medals and whatnot. For me, though, it's what Thurston did in the Origin arena that just elevates him to a new level. I would have him and Wally Lewis. As far as moments go, I'm not sure if there's a guy that has more Origin moments than Jonathan Thurston. Freak.
Well, there you go. Shall we move on?
Yeah.
Billy Slater is the next one, and you mentioned him previously before. I think there's those 3 from Melbourne that we're going to see. The third name will be mentioned shortly, but just the impact that these 3 have had in their careers. But not only what they did for Melbourne, what they did for Australia. Billy also played 30 test matches for Australia, but you mentioned State of Origin. These guys are just iconic State of Origin faces. And it's also here that Billy scored 190 tries in 310 games.
Yeah, I think he's actually behind AJ now.
319, 319 NRL matches.
Yeah. I think he's 3rd now maybe on the NRL top try scoring list or something like that. But, just an incredible career from Billy Slater. And, if you go back and you listen to Billy Slater's story, like he trialled for teams up in Brisbane and didn't make the sides. Then he drove himself down to Melbourne for a trial. And from that, Craig Bellamy picks him up and he ends up being the greatest fullback we've ever seen. Well, in my opinion, the greatest fullback we've ever seen. The only guy that you could put alongside him, in my opinion, is Clive Churchill, who's an immortal, but I didn't see Clive Churchill. There's not much tape of Clive Churchill. It was a different game back then. For me, I think Slater is the greatest fullback we've ever seen. And there's probably Cam Smith, who I think is the greatest hooker we've ever seen. There's no question mark. When you get to other positions, I don't think it's as clear-cut, the greatest of all time in those positions. I think with Slater, there is just no question. I think Slater is the best fullback we've ever seen. Halfback, 5'8". I think Joey's the best, but people will make arguments for Langer and a few other guys. 5'8", Wally Lewis, Brad Fittler, Lockyer, a bit of an open case. I think Slater, it is him daylight to second.
Yeah, and how often do you see a current player almost replicating his style as well?
It's every single player wants to be like Billy. Yeah. And the thing that, all these numbers and stats as Billy's career gets further and further away from us, the tries, all the highlights, all that stuff will forever live on. But the things that people watched his career from day one that they'll never forget is, and if you talk to any of the halves that played against him, I remember talking to Sowie, who's one of the best kickers we've ever seen. And for a period of time, he was the best kicker for probably 3 years. And he just said, mate, against Slater, it was the biggest challenge of all to make the ball bounce because he was just never out of position.
Wow.
He was always in the right spot. And that's something that stats and everything will never show.
It'll never tell you either. Yeah, that's really interesting.
It's a number. You talk to any halves from that period that say coming up against Melbourne, it was, fuck, how am I going to get this ball to bounce? I can't get an edge anywhere on this guy.
Wow.
And it's credit to just how smart he was and how his understanding of the game, but also just how fit he is, which is just reps on reps on reps.
Yeah. And we see these days as well just how good his footy brain is.
Yeah,
his understanding of the game is far beyond most. Okay, Benji Marshall. Fun fact, he lives near me. We're neighbours. Benji Marshall is one of the other inductees. Now, he's obviously, a lot of people associate him with the West Tigers, the involvement that he had with that 05 premiership winning side. What a moment. 346 game career. And he also led New Zealand to World Cup glory.
I am so glad Benji's in this. I'm so happy to see Benji Marshall in this. I think he fully deserves this. I think that Benji, he might not have the stat sheet and everything to line up with these other guys. Like, for example, you look at Benji Marshall, and I don't have it in front of me. I'm just going to get it up now. But I would assume that probably for the last 8 years of Benji's career, I don't think he played finals footy, which is wild to think about.
Yeah, it is.
But what he did as a whole was just unbelievable. He's a Golden Boot winner. He only won Dally M 5 out of the year once. He got a Golden Boot in 2010. He didn't play finals for the last few years of his career and whatnot. But when I look at this guy, the number one thing that stands out for me, Kat, is just his influence on the game is just unbelievable. So It's crazy. And obviously, now that I think about it, he did play finals footy with South Sydney towards the back end, coming off the bench. But when he was the main ball player in the side, he didn't really play that much finals footy towards the back end of his career once he sort of left the Tigers. I think the Dragons might have made it for one game with South Sydney in his final year. But I don't care because of the guy he was and the influence he had on our game. And obviously that 05 premiership is unbelievable.
It's iconic.
And the moment that he had in that game, the flick ball, I look back at that 05 side and, you know, I think Scott Prince was the most important player in that side just because of the leadership and the direction he gave them. But Benji was the spark. Benji was the spark. And, you know, we look back at that side and go, oh, they were the team that would throw the ball around. The kid, like the guy that gave him the confidence to do that was the kid that was 2 years out of high school, Benji Marshall. Just incredible. When you look back at the start of his career, like the amount of injuries this guy had, it was just insane. I think he had 3 or 4 shoulder reconstructions in his first 5 or 6 year. The one season that he wasn't injured was the 2005 season where he went on to win the premiership for them and come up with that play. Like, just unbelievable, Benji. What he did for New Zealand during that period, as you said, that World Cup, incredible stuff to win that. And, you know, it doesn't shock me at the back end of his career that a guy like Wayne Bennett took him from club to club all over the place. The Tigers, with all due respect to them, they are probably one of the most dysfunctional franchises in Australian sport. The only moments where they haven't looked like a tyre fire is when Benji Marshall's there.
Wow.
And I just think that says so much. For that side to win in 05, like it's just at the end of the 04 season and the 03, 04, that sort of stuff, they were in an awful position. They had no right to win that comp whatsoever. And then this 19-year-old just gives them this confidence that we haven't seen before. And I think similar to what we were talking about with SJ the other day, Benji, he was different to everyone else and he played to his style, which I absolutely love. And I'm so glad to see him in this Hall of Fame because what matters, I don't give a fuck about how many games he won, lost, where he finished in season, what happened. The influence he had on people and how much popular...
Still having.
It's still, yes, exactly. It just puts Benji Marshall in a new tier for me.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And to the conversation earlier about Les Boyd, if we're talking about history and impact, Benji makes that list without 100%, a doubt.
Yeah.
Everybody knows him. Yeah. Everybody knows Benji Marshall.
Incredible. Yeah.
Okay, we mentioned earlier the 3 from Melbourne. We've come to the 3rd. This is Cooper Cronk. I know he is a personal favourite of yours. You love Cooper Cronk. His time with Melbourne Storm is iconic. He went on to win a premiership with the Roosters, 2 premierships with the Roosters.
Yeah.
Sorry, I tend to forget about premierships the Roosters have won. But 38 tests for Australia, 22 state of origins. His impact is without question.
I was talking about Cooper Cronk a lot on the podcast, so I don't have to go into too much depth here. But, we spoke about Billy Slater, couldn't make a team up there in Queensland, drove himself down to Melbourne for an opportunity. Mate, Cooper Cronk arrived at the Melbourne Storm as a winger who was a handy utility, and he turned himself into, in my opinion, the most pure halfback we've ever seen. And there are better halfbacks. Joey is a better halfback, but Cooper is a pure halfback. And I think with a lot of these guys, Kat, we'll talk about like Slater, for example. You say, every fullback wants to be like Slater and blah, 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 and wants to emulate him. The thing that stands out for me is that no one's been able to emulate Cooper Cronk because he is such a one of one. And he is an absolute robot in what he does. And people will say he's a system halfback. Bullshit. He is the system.
It's clinical.
It's clinical. It is so clinical and it's boring at times. But I'll tell you what's not boring, lifting a heap of fucking trophies and winning everything you do. The last 3 years of his career, he won 3 premierships in a row across 2 different clubs. Went to the Roosters. They were a stacked team. Sure, they weren't winning shit when he arrived. Give you the hot tip. They haven't won shit since he left either. Riddle me that. The Melbourne Storm were, grand final. They won a premiership in 2017, who I think is one of the best sides we've ever seen. They don't win another comp until 2020. Shocked me, the year after Cooper Cronk retired. And who beat them in a grand final in that time? Cooper Cronk with one arm. I mean, fucking miss me. You guys know how I feel. One of the greats of all time. He'll come up later in this podcast. Stay tuned.
Okay, then we're going to move on to a personal favourite of mine. I'm so happy to see this player make the list. Greg Inglis, such a gifted player, part of that iconic premiership win for South Sydney. He played 39 tests for Australia, countless state of origins as well for Queensland. GI. He absolutely deserves to be there.
Yeah, iconic player. One of those freak of nature kind of guys, GI. And, when he was at his best, he was just unstoppable. When he was at 70%, you might be had a chance of stopping him that day. But, he's just an absolute freak, GI. And I think the big thing that when you look, the further we get away from GI's career and you look back at his numbers and everything, what he did across wing, centre, fullback and 5'8". Like people forget, he's a Clive Churchill medalist playing 5'8". Salary cap drama, say whatever the hell you want. Sure, he still had those performances on those big stages. He was incredible. And I think that as much as you can say the salary cap drama took something away, I think it's the best thing that ever happened to GI because he made the move from Melbourne. He got away from the big three and he got to leave his own stamp on rugby league, which came in 2014. And that moment, him scoring that try into the goal, and I was lucky enough to be there that night. And I'm not a Souths fan, but it was one of the most emotional.
At that moment, though.
At that moment, bloody oath I was.
Who
I think
wasn't?
everyone was.
Yeah.
Like, I think there was even Canterbury fans who just went, "Fuck, we have just witnessed a moment. We've witnessed greatness." It was incredible. And GI, obviously, his career finished earlier than what it should because of injury and whatnot. But what he also did in the Origin arena, I think he's the leading try scorer in State of Origin history. And the second leading try scorer was the guy outside him who he was handing tries to. He's probably the most dominant outside back we've ever seen in rugby league history. An incredible player, premierships, Clive Churchill's, State of Origin, he just did it all, GI, and an incredible footballer.
Absolutely. And he's also one of those players that I've heard come up countless times from current players saying that they want to emulate the way that he plays.
He's the guy.
He's the guy. When they look at what a winger can do, they think, I want to do what he did.
And I think quite often, like with me, I obviously, I have a lot of focus on the young guys in rugby league and all that. And I think it's always very interesting. There's only a select few players that people will message me and say, this guy's the next. And it's always Sonny Bill. It's always GI. The genetic absolute freaks.
Yeah.
And I think when you're in those conversations, the next, it just shows how good you were. And GI he's probably the most common one.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very cool. Okay, let's move on to another South Sydney Rabbitohs edition. This one is, I believe, the first ever English international to be made part of the Hall of Fame, which is Sam Burgess.
Yeah, incredible stuff from Sam Burgess. Obviously, 2014, an incredible moment. As I said, I was out there watching the impact of that first tackle of James Graham, who, I've done a bit of work with and whatnot, and just knowing how much of a tough human James Graham is to go toe-to-toe with Sam Burgess. I know it's not rugby league related, but even just seeing Sam Burgess go on that, what's that show he went on a year or two ago? The one where they have to survive through challenges. SES. I don't watch it too closely, but I remember listening to Matty Johns on his podcast in the lead up to that show, and Matty Johns just said, I don't know of any information. I have nothing. They haven't even filmed the thing yet. He said Sam Burgess will not lose that. Because he is just his mindset, he is just a different breed. And to be honest with you, I think throughout Sam Burgess' career, that mindset actually cost him a lot because I think it ended up, I think it forced him to get a lot more injuries because he just went too hard all the time. And I'm glad that he had that moment in 2014 where it all came together and he got to have that crowning moment and obviously end that drought for South Sydney. The first time I ever saw Sam Burgess, Kat, was, I want to say 2009 or 2010. I was up at this early in the morning watching the test matches over from England. It was New Zealand versus England, and Sam Burgess, this young 18, 19-year-old who they reckon was pretty good. At that point, Fui Moi Moi was the best front rower in rugby league. Just about, he was the most dominant one. And he returned the ball off a dropout, and Sam Burgess absolutely leveled him. It is one of the biggest shots I have ever seen. And I straight away went, oh, fuck. This kid, there's something about him. And then obviously, I think it was the great Russell Crowe referred to him as the starry-eyed man, that he could just always see something in his eye. And, in the early parts of me doing Guru, Sam Burgess was still playing. He actually did a few things for me in the early days, a couple of videos and whatnot when I ran into him at coaches clinics when when South came to the schools I was teaching at. An incredible player, and to be the first Englishman, that actually surprised me. There's a few guys I thought would have been in there, but I guess none of them have had the influence that he had on our game here. For the young age he came over here and what he did, at a club like South Sydney. Just iconic stuff.
Yeah, I mean, he paved the way for the Burgess name in Australia, which is
still kicking.
Yeah, exactly. Still kicking and has had an unbelievable impact on the game.
Yeah, I don't think his impact on the NRL is done yet either. I think at some point we'll see him coaching here.
I think you might be right.
Exciting, yeah.
Well, that is it. That is the most recent list of inductees into the NRL Hall of Fame. Now, I have a feeling that this conversation is now going to go to the immortal conversation.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you, of this list, do you have any that stand out to you as, without question, they would and should be immortals?
Yes, I think there are a few that stand out for me. And when you're talking about the immortal, like you're almost talking about who shouldn't be immortals rather than who should. It's probably easier to do it that way. When you talk about, the guys at the start of the list, the older fellas, I don't think any of them have done enough in the game to be immortals. I think it sort of comes down to the guys that sort of came from this generation, with all due respect to those other guys. For me, as I said, Benji, he's in the Hall of Fame because of his influence on the game. I don't think he achieved enough to be an immortal in our game. And that's not being harsh. We're putting guys in the top 0.00001% of our game ever. You have to win premierships. You have to win a heap of awards. You have to do it for a long period of time. So Benji doesn't quite do it for me. I think GI, I think he's in the conversation, but I don't think GI gets it for me. I think he just misses out, unfortunately.
Is there something about GI's career or something missing for you?
It's just how good the other guys were. And it's how good they were from start to finish.
Yeah.
And that's not GI's fault. He had injuries at the back end of his career and all that sort of stuff. But if you're going to be really super, super nitpicky, there would be years where you go, oh, GI's not at his absolute best right now. Whereas when I'm talking about Cam Smith, when was his low point? Like, it just doesn't exist.
It's the consistency that takes them to that next level.
And this is I'm now trying to separate, as I said, the top 0.001 and the top 0.0015. It's just insanity how good these guys are, but there can only be an X amount of immortals. I think Thurston is in the conversation. He wouldn't be an immortal for me though. But there are very good arguments that what he did in the Origin career should maybe in the Origin arena, should push him in there. For me, Thurston won all the Dally M medals, and that was incredible. I do think the Dally M system, however you're going to do it, there's going to be flaws in it. And I do think some of those flaws probably played a little bit of an advantage to JT, being the main guy in his team and everything. But JT can only play by the rules that you set out to him, and he did incredibly well. For me, though, I just think I almost choked. Defensively, JT wasn't as good as some of these other guys, and just it all depends how you look at it. For me, defense, it's 50% of the game. It has to matter. Yeah. People would argue being halfbacks and 5'8", it doesn't matter. I don't care. I definitely do. It's literally 50% of the game. If you're setting up 2 tries and conceding 1 or 2, I look at a guy like Joey, who was as good in attack as he was in defense. You can almost argue Joey was better in defense than he was in attack, which is wild. So for JT, I also look at, he won 2 premierships in 04. He came off the bench. It wasn't really his team. And 15, he had that incredible moment where he kicks the field goal. Unbelievable stuff. But if you look at the rest of the game, he was pretty poor throughout the game. So for me, JT just misses out on immortality for me. But if you have the argument that, hey, you just said he's one of the greatest Origin players, if not the greatest Origin player, I go, yep.
An Origin immortal.
I get that. An Origin is one of the pinnacles. So it's hard to separate these guys. But for me, I think the big 3 at Melbourne, they are the 3 guys for me. I think that Cameron Smith is the best hooker we've ever seen and arguably the best player. I think Billy Slater is the best fullback we've ever seen. I think he needs to be an immortal. And for me, I think Cooper Cronk's the best winner of the modern era. And for me, that matters. Is he the best halfback? No, I don't think I think Joey's the best halfback. But I would have Cooper Cronk just behind him. And they're very different players, and people will say Cooper's a system halfback. I've spoken about this. I'll tell you what Cooper's system was. It was fucking winning, which to me kind of matters. Cooper was the best at doing it. I call him the architect of success, Kat. You like that? Very good. Cooper, I would have him as an immortal. I know that's controversial. Me and Matty the Waterboy get drunk all the time and yell and scream at each other. He's Team JT. I'm Cooper Cronk.
If you listen carefully, you can actually hear him screaming from
You'll
bloke.
be able to hear it echoing around Rosebery quite often and at the Caxton at Magic Round. But yeah, they would be my three that would be immortals out of those guys. But, you know, it's obviously a huge debate with so many factors to take in and whatnot. And, I mean, can you even put that many guys in? Like, can you make three immortals from one team? People say no, but I've never really heard anyone having a huge issue with there being 4 Dragons from one team from the 1960s. So I think they were the 3 best players in their position of their time. And, yeah, they're the guys that I would take personally. There's the argument that JT played in a lesser team and all that, and I get that 100%, but I think when you're talking about greatest players of all time, it has to be based on what they achieved, not what they could have achieved if situations were better and if things had happened. You're talking about the greatest of all time. It has to be based on what they achieved and what they did. So for me, I think the big 3 are the only 3 that could come out of that group to be immortals. I'm not ruling JT out. I think he has a chance to still do it, but if I was picking it, it'd be those 3 for me. What are your thoughts?
There is such an element of subjectivity to it because obviously
that's the beauty of it.
When I think as someone who didn't play, just watched, I see Greg Inglis as somebody worthy of being an immortal. It's his influence too on the emerging Indigenous players too. I see Ty Munro shared his photo yesterday and calling him the GOAT. And I just took a moment to think to myself, you know what, they would look up to the likes of Greg Inglis as the guy that they want to replicate out on the field. And maybe a lack of consistency from one perspective might omit him from that conversation. But I think there's always that conversation around impact outside of the game as well. And to be a trailblazer in any sense of the word it's so difficult to be the first to do anything. So I think for me, he'd absolutely be worthy of being considered an immortal. But I also get the rationale from the other side.
100%, yeah, and it's completely fair. And GI, you know, once again, is he the greatest outside back we've ever seen? I think he's probably the most damaging outside back we've ever seen. So by that regard, why shouldn't he be an immortal?
Yeah,
it's all as you said, it's so subjective. However you want to look at it and whatnot, and I probably do lean towards spine players a little bit more, and maybe that's my bias. I'm happy to wear that, but yeah, like if you said to me, are we ever going to see a more damaging outside back than GI? I'd probably say I don't think so. So maybe there is a fair argument. And once again, you know, you look at what he did in Origin, and just having a look through his sheet of achievements, just incredible. And you know what? Maybe that leans into, you know, what I said to you, sometimes GL wasn't at his best. It's like, oh yeah, dickhead. Well, how did he achieve all this stuff then? You know, like, it's all subjective and it's all whatever you guys think. I'd love to hear in the comments what you guys think, who you think out of this group should be an immortal. If someone you think was unlucky to miss Hall of Fame honours, you'd probably have to Google and look at who the previous ones are because we don't seem to keep too much track of it and whatnot, which is brutal. But yeah, let me know in the comments, guys, your thoughts, some of my takes. I've got the big 3 becoming immortals. I've got JT and GI just missing out on it, but I'm very, very keen to hear your thoughts in the comments. Today's episode brought to you by Ned. Shout out to them, always doing fantastic things, and on their app, you can follow along with all of our bets and all the bets of the boys on About Even each and every week on the Neds app. Prices subject to change, T's and C's apply, and available on the website. What are you really gambling with? For free and confidential support, visit gamblinghelponline.org.au.
What are you really gambling with? For free and confidential support, call the number on the screen or visit the website